Are we switched on?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, good evening. Welcome everybody, and a particularly warm welcome if you're joining us on the internet. We're glad to have you with us. We're carrying on this evening with the book of Ezekiel. And when I find out where we are, I'll let you know. Right, we're going to be picking it up in chapter 5 and starting at verse 11, I believe. Unless anybody else knows different. It's been a long time since last week. Okay, last week, if you remember, we left it and we were talking about God withdrawing his hands of protection and support from people, and that people would inevitably behave in the way that sinful human beings would always behave without God's guidance and protection, including, unfortunately, like the word says, eating the children. Okay, we'll read from verse 11 to 13. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your vile images and detestable practices, I myself will withdraw my favor. I will not look upon you with pity or spare you. A third of your people will die from the plague or perish by famine. A third will fall by the sword outside your walls, and a third I will scatter to the winds. Then my anger will cease, and my wrath against them will subside, and I will be avenged. And when I have spent my wrath upon them, they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal. And the first thing that caught my eye when I read that was that simple statement, therefore as I live. That's a simple statement, and I believe it's simply the God of Israel contrasting himself with the idols that they are worshipping. He is declaring to the world, I live. And I live, but these don't. These are worthless pieces of stone and wood. But I live. That's an amazing statement in itself. You know, I live. It goes on to say, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things. Now the pagans didn't have God's sanctuary in their midst. The people of Judah had this special place in their midst where the God of creation lived, yet they defiled it with detestable things and abominations. And in fairness, perhaps I shouldn't say this, but you don't see the nations around Israel defiling their altars. They might not be worshipping real gods, but they still treat their altars and their holy places probably with more reverence than the Israelites were treating where God lived. We don't know what these detestable practices are at this particular time in the book, but you can be sure the people of God knew what it was all about. And don't forget, it's only been 50 years or so since the rediscovery of the scroll containing the book of the law. And it was read out in the presence of the people. So they knew exactly what they were doing wrong. And we spoke last week about God withdrawing his hand, and verse 11 confirms it. As we read, God himself is saying, I will withdraw my favor. I will not look upon you with pity or spare you. I don't think I ever want to hear God say that to me. We read that a third of the people will die by plague or famine. A third will die by the sword outside the city. And a third are going to be scattered to the winds with the sword chasing them. But you know, we talked before about what the word actually says. And the only one of those three things that has "I will" attached to it is scattering the people to the winds, where God says, "I will scatter the people to the winds." Prior to that, he doesn't say, "I will cause a third of the people to die by plague," or "I will cause a third of the people to die by the sword." So I believe we can infer from that that is something that is happening, not because God has caused it, but because he's allowed it. It's happening because he's withdrawn his hand from the people. And the people are turned over to their natural consequences, which is, if your city is being attacked, then you've had it. So many of you are going to be killed. So many of you are going to be running for your life. God doesn't have to cause it. We do that to ourselves, all on our own. But the one thing God does say, "I will," is, "I will scatter a third to the wind." Then my anger will cease, and my wrath against them will subside, and I will be avenged. I've always found that a tough sentence to read. And I'm sure I'm not on my own, because it paints a picture of God that we're probably not familiar with today, and are probably very uncomfortable with, if the truth be known. Since many people today don't believe that physical discipline of a child, or indeed of an adult for that matter, is allowed, it's a taboo subject. It's not surprising that many people find the thought of God chastising people with force disturbing. But you know, even though these particular passages may be disconcerting, you have to take it in context. You have to look at the whole big picture, instead of just focusing on one thing, in this case, God's anger. And you must also take into account the problems of translating the Bible into English, because there are some words that are simply untranslatable, and the translators do their best, but inevitably they're going to alter the meaning of what the original author was trying to say slightly. And one thing I want to say now is that the words wrath and anger do not mean that God has got a bad temper and he needs to be appeased before he can be merciful to us. Nor does it mean that he feels angry with us and needs to be calmed down or placated by our repentance before he'll calm down. Doesn't mean either of those things. And it doesn't mean that God has a strict, vengeful side to his personality that needs to be, if you like, bought off before he can be merciful to us. Because God hasn't got any sides like that to his character at all. And hard as it may be for us, and I think most of us, when we think about heaven and things of eternity and God, sometimes there are things we just can't get our head around. And this is one of them, that God is always infinitely perfect in every way. Infinitely perfect, infinitely merciful in everything that he does. There's no real spite or anger in there. It's just perfect justice. But neither should we run away with the fact that God doesn't get angry, because yes, God does get angry. And you've only got to look at Jesus to see that, because while he was on earth, he got angry. And didn't he say that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father? So yes, God does get angry, but it's not a vengeful, spiteful anger that takes great delight in watching people suffer just because they've wronged him. It's righteous anger. It's an anger that cares about others. It's an anger that attacks sin instead of the sinner. And righteous anger doesn't seek to hurt. Righteous anger stems from love. And love doesn't retaliate, or at least it shouldn't. Righteous anger born from love recognizes that someone's actions or words have strayed from the path of righteousness, and love brings about that desire to bring the person back to the truth. When it comes to talking about God being angry, I suppose you could say that God's anger perhaps is not the real issue. Our sinful reaction to the anger is the problem. It's because we're used to seeing anger associated with hate and the need for revenge. And when you talk about God being angry, that's our default mode. God's angry, therefore he wants revenge. But God isn't like that. God's righteous anger is born out of love and concern for us. And of course, God is not able to sin. Therefore, exhibiting any reactions like spite or the need for vengeance, he can't do it because that's a sinful reaction and God can't sin. So God's anger is always born out of and tinged with love for us. Although I've got to be honest, I sometimes wonder how he can ever love me, but there we are. I'm sure we all say that. God is the divine perfection of justice. And it's that justice which causes him to permit the self-destructive effects of evil and allow them to run their course. In other words, God's wrath and anger means that if we are stubbornly evil and impenitent, he will permit the sin in our life to have its inevitable destructive way in our life. So we need to remember that this anger of God's is righteous anger. It's not born out of bad temper. It doesn't mean that we have to bribe him and pay him off to calm him down. It's righteous anger born out of love. And we can carry that knowledge with us as we read right throughout the Bible, because every time you hear of God being angry, it's righteous anger. And usually, if the truth be known, we've done something to deserve it. Bible commentator Kaufman put it like this: all of the ancient prophets speak in the most eloquent and frightening terms of the wrath of God. God's anger against sin is much more terrible reality than most men suppose. The modern conception of God has reduced him to the status of a benevolent old grandpa, so indifferent to the sins raging in his presence that he would scarcely punish anybody. Is he not a God of love, they say? Indeed he is. But this must also be reconciled with his unmitigated anger and his intolerance of all sin. Amen. The God of the Old Testament is absolutely the same God as the God of the New Testament. And God's incredible, amazingly loving and patient in the Old Testament. His patience with Israel is spectacular. Time and time again they rebelled against him, committed idolatry and every other kind of sin, yet he had chosen them and he continued to forgive them and to keep them as his people. God did discipline his people, but he only did this with hope that they would repent and continue to be his people. He disciplined them because he loved them. And I think it's true, because we do tend, if we're not careful, to look at the God of love and forget that there's an anger there as well. And really what we read in the Old Testament, he's the same God. But we shouldn't be frightened of what we read, because it's righteous anger born out of love. And the simple truth is, if you want to avoid God's anger, don't do anything wrong. It's flatly that simple, isn't it? And if you do anything wrong, repent of it as soon as you realize you've done it. Because God is a very patient God, and he will put up with a lot. But like everybody, I suppose, well, not everybody, but some people, I'm one of those people. You can push me a long way, an awful long way. But when you hit the button, I wouldn't be anywhere near me. And God is the same kind of thing. He's patient. He's got a lot going on. He will put up with a lot. But sooner or later, there's a line in the sand where God will say, this has got to end. I cannot allow this sin to go on any longer. And the Israelites have reached that point. The people of Judah, they've crossed the line in the sand.
Also, Steve, we're living now in the dispensation of grace.
Yes.
Because of what Christ did for us.
Yes.
I often thank the Lord that I was born now and not in the Old Testament.
Absolutely right. Yes. Yes. And remember, discipline is usually applied after disobedience. And you can trace the Israelites' disobedience right back to the day Moses led them out of Egypt. All through the Exodus, they grumbled and complained and did things God had told them not to do and didn't do things he told them they had to. And yet all these hundreds of years, God has been patient with them. All right, we've seen individual acts of punishment. I can't remember his name, but the gentleman who kept some of the plunder from... thank you, yes. And the ground opened up, individual act of punishment. But by and large, God has been extremely tolerant with the Israelites as a race of people for a very, very long time. But eventually we read that God says his anger will cease and his wrath against them will subside. And this simply means that the purpose that God intended his anger to achieve has been fulfilled. And evidence that it has fulfilled its purpose, you've only got to look at other books in the Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah, where there is a remnant that actually go back to Jerusalem dead keen on rebuilding the temple and following God's laws again. So obviously the anger and the wrath, if we call it that God unleashed and to punish these people has done its job. It's brought them back to him again. So please don't get alarmed when you read the Old Testament and God getting angry. It's not the picture that you're probably conjuring up in your head. I know when I was young, I had this picture of God stamping round with fire and smoke coming out of his ears, bawling and yelling and screaming. It used to frighten me to death, to be honest. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. But it's not like that, because God's anger is righteous anger. And it's born out of love for us and a desire to make sure that we have the best in life. God is perfect. He can't sin. So the anger that he exhibits can't not be anything other than righteous anger. You know, God would much rather grant mercy and forgiveness than express his anger. But summing up the whole idea of God's wrath against his people, the Expositor's Bible commentary puts it like this. It's clear that the Creator and Lord of all cannot be expected to alter the principles of his government in order to accommodate himself to the follies and caprices of his creatures. If a man throws himself into the mid-ocean or into the crater of a burning volcano, nature is against him and he must perish. If a man by his own action contracts disease, he must suffer. Gravity is not to be suspended because a foolhardy fanatic flings himself from a tower, nor are the chemical laws to be abolished because one ignorantly swallows poison. In all such cases, we may say with reverence, God is against those who act in such and such a manner. And similarly, in the moral realm, the spiritual universe is so constituted that men cannot violate moral law without suffering, cannot defy God with impunity. Those who sin must sooner or later learn the fact that no reason of theirs can affect that God is against them. And I think that puts it really, really well. There's laws, if you like, in the heavenly world as well as laws in our world. And they just cannot be suspended or contravened. You can't suspend gravity. If you go against the laws of heaven, you must pay the price for it. Let's pick it up at verse 14 and read till verse 17. I will make you a ruin and a reproach among the nations around you, in the sight of all who pass by. You will be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and an object of horror to the nations around you, when I inflict punishment on you in anger and in wrath and with stinging rebuke. I, the Lord, have spoken. When I shoot at you with my deadly and destructive arrows of famine, I will shoot to destroy you. I will bring more and more famine upon you and cut off your supply of food. I will send famine and wild beasts against you, and they will leave you childless. Plague and bloodshed will sweep through you, and I will bring the sword against you. I, the Lord, have spoken. Now we can see why Ezekiel was told to live on starvation rations for the duration of his time on his side. Because it was his way of demonstrating what God was saying, that they were going to be desperately, desperately short of food and starving. But the object here is to make Judah and Jerusalem a warning to the nations around them. Calvin says, he explains what we saw before more at length, whence also we understand that in the next verse God had not softened his anger, but proclaimed the ultimate destruction of the nation. He says therefore that the Jews shall be desolate, as they translate it, but it also signifies dryness, and hence the name for a desert. But it suits this place to say the Jews shall be laid waste, and a reproach among the nations. For they were formerly a celebrated nation. God had ennobled them with remarkable gifts, so that they excelled in dignity in the sight of all the nations. Now he says they should be a vast desert, and in utter ruin and reproach. And not only is this rumour spread abroad, but all travellers through that land will be witnessing this reproach. So Jerusalem's punishment is not only for her own sins, it's also a lesson to the nations around them, allowing them to see that sin always brings trouble and sorrow. And only as nations walk before God in righteousness will they have his approval and blessing. And just to make sure that the people know where all this is coming from, the chapter ends with Ezekiel being told to say, I, the Lord, have spoken. And so that is confirmation that this is not just Ezekiel spouting off and saying what comes into his head. He is actually saying what God tells him to say. And that is all wrapped up with, I, the Lord, have spoken. Okay, let's turn to chapter 6. And I'll read the first 7 verses. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, set your face against the mountains of Israel. Prophesy against them and say, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and hills, to the valleys and ravines. I am about to bring the sword against you, and I will destroy your high places. Your altars will be demolished, and your incense altars will be smashed, and I will slay your people in front of your idols. I will lay the dead bodies of the Israelites in front of their idols, and I will scatter your bones around the altars. Wherever you live, the towns will be laid waste, and the high places demolished, so that your altars will be laid waste and devastated. Your idols smashed and ruined, your incense altars broken down, and what you have made wiped out. Your people will fall slain among you, and you will know that I am the Lord. The time has come now for Ezekiel's, if we can call it acting, or charades, to stop. He's speaking plain now on behalf of the Lord. He's told to turn and face the direction of Israel. But you know, I can still see a little bit of flair in the way perhaps Ezekiel does this, a little bit of the dramatic coming about with him. But he's told to turn and face the direction of Israel, because this prophecy is directed at the mountains and the valleys, because they helped to define the geography of Israel. But more importantly, these hills and valleys and ravines were centers of idol worship, the infamous high places that we hear about so many times in the Old Testament. And altars to pagan gods were often set up on the tops of hills and mountains in the lands around Israel and in the border regions. Probably in any part of Palestine you cared to walk around in those days, you would have seen a mountain or a hill crowned with an altar, perhaps one or two standing stones, a wooden pillar or something, or a clump of trees. These hills and mountains were flourishing centers of the old Canaanite religions, which should have been destroyed. And this idolatry on the high places was inherited from the Canaanites and often practiced by the Israelites, simply because, again, there was disobedience. They weren't destroyed as God had told them to. The ravines and the valleys were scenes of Baal worship and of child sacrifice. And if you want to look that up, you can find it in Isaiah 57, verse 5. And as I mentioned last week, it's only 50 years ago since King Josiah read the book of the law that had been recently discovered while the work was being done in the temple. I'm going to give us a flashback now. I want you to listen to this. It's from 2 Kings 23, but it tells us, as Josiah cleans the land up, what sort of things was going on in Israel. And perhaps we'll get an idea of why the Lord was so angry. The king ordered Hilkiah the priests next in rank and the doorkeepers, to remove from the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and Asherah and all the starry hosts. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley and took the ashes to Bethel. He did away with the idolatrous priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense on these high places of towns of Judah and on those around. Those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and moon, to the constellations and all the starry hosts. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. He also tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, the quarters where women did weave in for Asherah. Josiah brought all the priests from the towns of Judah and desecrated the high places, from Geba to Beersheba, where the priests had burned incense. He broke down the gateway at the entrance to the gate of Joshua, the city governor, which was on the left of the city gate. Although priests of the high places did not serve at the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, they ate unleavened bread with their fellow priests. He desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Molech. He removed from the entrance of the temple of the Lord the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were in the court near the room of an official named Nathan Melech. Josiah then burned the chariots that were dedicated to the sun. He pulled down the altars of the kings of Judah had erected on the roof near the upper room of Ahaz, and the altars Manasseh had built in the 2 courts of the temple of the Lord. He removed them from there, smashed them to pieces, and threw the rubble in the Kidron Valley. The king also desecrated the high places that were east of Jerusalem on the south of the hill of corruption, the one Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the vile god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the people of Ammon. Josiah smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the site with human bones. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he demolished. He burned the high place and ground it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole also. Then Josiah looked around, and when he saw the tombs that were there on the hillside, he had the bones removed and had them burned on the altar to defile it, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by the man of God who foretold these things. The king asked, "Who is that tombstone I see?" The people of the city said, "It marks the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done to it." "Leave it alone," said the king. "Don't let anyone disturb his bones." So they spared the bones of the prophet who had come from Samaria. Just as he had done at Bethel, Josiah removed the shrines at the high places that the kings of Israel had built in the towns of Samaria and that had aroused the Lord's anger. Josiah slaughtered all the priests of those high places and altars and burned human bones on them. Then he went back to Jerusalem. He then gave the order to the people, celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in the book of the covenant. Neither in the days of the judges who led Israel, nor in the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah had any such Passover been observed. But in the 18th year of Josiah, this Passover was celebrated in Jerusalem. And furthermore, Josiah got rid of the mediums and spiritists, the household gods, the idols, and all the other detestable things seen in Judah and Jerusalem. He did this to fulfill the requirements of the law written in the book that Hilkiah the priest had recently discovered in the temple of the Lord. How the mighty have fallen, eh? God's people, and listen to what they were getting up to. It's no wonder God was angry. It could only ever have ended one way, when they were doing such detestable things, and especially in the temple of the Lord. You know, having heard what Josiah did throughout the land of Judah, and knowing that the Israelites have fallen back into doing the same thing all over again, we can see that God's chosen people have not only defiled themselves by their detestable practices, but they've defiled the land as well. That is why Ezekiel was told to make this prophecy against the land. And he predicts this slaughter that's going to come about, and the places where they have worshipped these false gods are going to be destroyed. He predicts the idols will be broken, and the pieces of the idols will be scattered with the bones of the people who had turned away from God in this sacrilege to worship the idols in high places. You know, I think basically what God is going to do is basically what Josiah has done. Smash the place up, get rid of all the idols, smash them down, burn the incense altars, only he's going to use the invading army to do it. Everything they have made will be destroyed, and the dead bodies of the Israelites will be laid out in front of the altars, these pagan altars, and the bones scattered around. Now, I don't think that's a random act, the bodies laid out in front of the altars. I think this is meant, A, to desecrate the altars, and B, to show that these gods and the altars have got no power to bring these people back to life, because they are not living gods. They are simply idols made of stone and wood. And the scattering of the bones is a method of desecrating temples and altars. Matthew Henry put it like this: thus the idols were upbraided with their inability to help their worshippers, and idolaters were upbraided with the folly of trusting in them. For it should seem that they fell by the sword of the enemy when they were actually before the very idols, imploring them to aid and putting themselves under their protection. Because the land had been defiled by idols, the idols themselves would now be defiled by the corpses of the worshippers, a retribution in kind. This would have been the height of desecration, replacing the fragrance of incense with the odor of putrefaction. It's a pretty graphic Old Testament, really, isn't it, when you think about it? You know, they don't pull any punches when you read through it. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because let's be honest, even today we still need God to not pull any punches, to drag us out of our apathy, and to take us out of our comfort zone, if you like, now and again. It's a brutally graphic description of what's going to take place, and many of the Judean cities are going to suffer terribly during this Babylonian invasion. And you know, you can see evidence of this today, because archaeologists have excavated the sites of the old cities of Arad, Lachish, Ramat Rahel, En-Gedi, Timnah, Ekron, and Jerusalem, and all of those cities are showing signs of destruction from about this time. The only region that appears to have left unscathed is North Jerusalem, which escaped relatively unscathed. But archaeologists are finding all of these cities showing signs of massive destruction, which simply backs up what the Bible is telling us. And I know people do rubbish the Bible and say, that didn't happen, that's fantasy. But archaeology is proving a lot of these stories more and more as time goes by. And we're getting to the point now where you have to be a fool to not believe that the Bible is true and what it says happened actually happened. But I'm just going to inject a note of caution here before we finish for the evening. As we read through and study Ezekiel and look at what's happened to the people of Judah and the Israelites, we should remember that we are only human like them. And if we are not very careful, we can fall into that same trap of idolatry that they fell into. Listen to the words of Dr. Thomas Constable. What idolatry most reveals about the people who practice it is not merely another faith, but also an actual lack of faith. Modern idolatry, like the ancient Near Israelite Eastern kind, is essentially materialistic. Instead of full reliance on God, while we may not deny his existence, we don't trust him to take care of us materially. Thus, we do everything we can to gain worldly possessions, to secure our future, to have a comfortable retirement, and to succeed in a competitive world. But with this comes the danger of losing our own souls, because we cannot serve God and money. When we fail to trust God for our needs, we go far beyond the bounds of providing for our basic requirements and can thus trap ourselves in modern idolatry, which is nothing other than materialism. And I think that's a fair statement. And when we're looking at the Bible and studying it, we need to remember that we're human. We can do the same things that these people have done. In fact, we're worse off than they are because there is so much available today for us to own and buy. There is so much available for us to put our faith in that we have to, if anything, be more careful than the Israelites that had to be in their day. And even, I might add, with the miracles that we still see day by day, it's still so easy to fall off that road to heaven if we're not careful. And I'm going to end it there for tonight, if you don't mind.
That statement you just said,
Yeah.
that was me.
I think it's all